The first snow came early that year, a month before anyone expected it, and by the time the widow latched her cabin door against the November wind, the world outside had already turned into a landscape of white silence, broken only by the howl of air through pine branches and the occasional crack of ice forming on the eaves. Inside, the small wooden structure smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and if you looked carefully at the shelves lining the back wall, you would see something unusual. Rows of metal tins, old coffee cans, cookie containers with tight-fitting lids, even repurposed paint cans scrubbed clean and sealed with layers of wax around the rim. Each one labeled in neat handwriting: flour, rice, oats, dried beans, cornmeal, sugar, salt, tea. The widow moved between them with practiced efficiency, checking seals, rotating stock, wiping down surfaces with vinegar water. Her neighbors thought she was paranoid. When she mentioned mice at the community gathering in October, back when the ground was still soft and people could still drive the logging road into town, they had smiled indulgently. One man laughed outright, said she was preparing for a siege, asked if she expected an army of rats. She had simply nodded, continued packing her supplies into the back of her truck, and driven home alone. But she knew. She had lived through enough winters in this isolated valley to understand what most people refuse to acknowledge until it was too late. When the temperature drops and stays down, when the ground freezes solid and the natural food sources disappear beneath 3 feet of snow, everything that can move seeks warmth and calories. Mice, especially the deer mice common to this region, stop being the timid creatures of summer. They become relentless, intelligent, and desperate. They can smell food through wood, through plastic, through layers of fabric. They can gnaw through cardboard in minutes, through thin plastic in an hour, through soft wood in a night. They leave droppings that carry hantavirus, salmonella, and a dozen other pathogens that can turn a simple meal into a medical emergency when the nearest hospital is 40 miles away and the roads are impassable. They contaminate 10 times what they eat, urinating on surfaces, dragging nest material into food stores, spreading bacteria with every step. And in a winter that might last 5 months, where every calorie counts and resupply is impossible, losing even a single bag of flour to contamination can mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. The widow understood these facts not from books, but from experience. Her first winter alone, 7 years ago, she had stored food the way everyone else did. Bags and boxes on shelves, some things in the pantry, some in the root cellar, confident that her cabin was tight enough to keep the cold out and therefore tight enough to keep pests out. She learned otherwise on a January night when she woke to scratching sounds in the walls and found, by morning, that mice had chewed through a paper sack of oatmeal, scattered it across the floor, and left droppings in her sugar bin. She had cleaned it up, set a few traps, thought the problem was solved, but the raids continued. Every few nights, new evidence. Gnawed corners on cardboard boxes, tiny holes in plastic bags, a trail of rice leading from the pantry to a gap behind the baseboard. She started moving food to higher shelves. The mice climbed. She put things in plastic bins with snap-on lids. The mice chewed through the corners where the plastic was thinnest. By February, she had lost 20 pounds of staples to contamination and was rationing her remaining supplies, eating smaller meals, going to bed hungry, watching her hands tremble when she split firewood because her body was running on insufficient fuel. That spring, when the thaw finally came and she could drive out for supplies, she bought metal. Every tin, can, and jar she could find. She spent an entire summer testing them, deliberately leaving crumbs outside the containers, watching to see if mice could find a way in. The ones with loose lids failed immediately. The ones with plastic seals lasted longer but eventually showed gnaw marks. The only containers that held were metal with tight friction-fit lids or screw tops, preferably with a layer of beeswax or food-grade sealant around the rim to fill microscopic gaps. She learned to store these containers off the floor, either on high shelves or hanging from ceiling hooks on wire that mice could not climb. She learned to keep the area around them scrupulously clean, no crumbs, no spills, no scent trails. She learned to use secondary containment, putting the metal tins inside larger bins or crates so that even if a mouse reached the shelf, it would have to navigate another barrier. And she learned to be relentless about entry points, sealing every crack in the walls with steel wool and caulk, every gap around pipes with expanding foam and wire mesh, checking and rechecking because mice can squeeze through holes the size of a dime. Her neighbors saw the results of this obsession, but not the reasoning behind it. They saw a woman who spent hours arranging cans like some kind of military quartermaster. They saw someone who washed her hands before and after touching food, who kept a logbook of inventory, who set out snap traps even when there was no evidence of mice, who burned food scraps instead of composting them, who swept her floors twice a day. They thought she was eccentric at best, mentally unstable at worst. When she tried to explain the caloric mathematics, the fact that a single family of mice could destroy enough food in a week to represent 14 full meals for a human, they nodded politely and changed the subject. When she offered to show them her system, the tins and the seals and the storage protocols, they thanked her and said they would keep it in mind. None of them took her seriously. And so, when the snow came early and thick and the temperatures dropped to 10 below zero and stayed there, when the world closed in and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away through drifts that reached the windowsills, they were unprepared for what came next. The raids started in the second week of November. The widow heard them first, just after dark, a faint scratching sound in the walls that most people would have dismissed as settling wood or wind in the eaves. But she knew the difference. She lit a lantern and moved quietly through the cabin, listening. The sound came from near the pantry, behind the back wall where the studs met the floor joists. She set 2 snap traps there, baited with a smear of peanut butter, and went back to bed. By morning, both traps had been triggered and reset by the vibration, but no mice caught. They were learning. She set 4 more traps, varied the positions, added a bucket trap with water in the bottom as a backup. That night she caught 2. Small deer mice with enormous eyes and soft gray fur and bodies so light they barely weighed an ounce. She disposed of them in the morning, checked her stores, found no new damage. But the scratching continued. Every night for a week, 2 to 4 mice caught, evidence of more in the droppings that appeared in corners despite her constant sweeping. She knew what this meant. The population outside was under pressure, starving, and her cabin represented the only reliable food source for possibly miles. They would keep coming until the cold killed them, or she killed them, or they found a way past her defenses. Her nearest neighbor, a man in his 60s who lived in a larger cabin with his adult son, stopped by one afternoon to borrow kerosene. He noticed the traps, the tins, the smell of vinegar from her latest cleaning session. He asked if she was having mouse trouble. She said yes. About 4 successful breaches per week where mice got into the cabin, though none had reached the food yet. He laughed, said he had seen a few droppings in his own place but nothing serious, told her she was overreacting. She asked how he stored his food. He said the usual way, bags and boxes in the pantry, some canned goods, plenty of supplies, nothing to worry about. She offered to help him set up a better system. He declined. Said he had managed just fine for 20 years and did not need advice from someone who spent half her time scrubbing floors. She let it go. There was nothing more she could say. People learned through consequences, not warnings. The cold deepened. By mid-November, the daytime highs never reached above freezing and the nighttime lows dropped to 15, then 20 below. The widow's routines became a kind of meditation. Wake before dawn, rekindle the fire, check the traps, inspect the cabin for new entry points, prepare a small breakfast from the tins, clean up immediately with no crumbs left behind, spend the morning splitting wood or mending clothes or reading, prepare lunch with the same meticulous care, afternoon chores, dinner, evening cleaning, set the traps, bank the fire, sleep. Every 3 days she would do a full inventory, opening each tin, checking for any sign of moisture or damage, rotating stock so that the oldest supplies were used first. Every week she would inspect the walls and floor, running her fingers along the baseboards looking for drafts, checking the areas around pipes and wires, anywhere a mouse might find an opening. She found gaps sometimes, places where the cold had contracted the wood enough to create cracks no thicker than a pencil lead, and she would seal them immediately with steel wool packed tight and covered with caulk. It was tedious work. It was exhausting work. But it was necessary work, and she did it without complaint because the alternative was unthinkable. The neighbor's situation began to deteriorate in late November. The widow saw him one morning, trudging through the snow toward her cabin with a grim expression. He said they had a problem. Mice had gotten into their pantry, chewed through bags of flour and sugar, contaminated their oatmeal and rice. He asked if she had extra food to spare. She asked how much they had lost. He said maybe 10 pounds, 15, hard to tell because they had to throw out anything that showed droppings or gnaw marks. She asked about their storage. He admitted they had not changed anything, thought the cold would keep the mice outside. She told him the cold did the opposite, drove them inside where it was warm and food was available. She gave him a 5-pound bag of rice from her reserves, showed him one of her sealed tins, explained the system. He took the rice, thanked her, looked at the tin with skepticism, and left. She knew he would not implement the changes. It was too much work, too much disruption, easier to believe the problem would solve itself. But the problem never solved itself. The problem only got worse until you addressed the root cause. December arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days and buried the valley under 4 feet of new snow. The widow stayed inside, maintaining her routines, burning through her firewood at a steady rate, eating simple meals of beans and rice and cornbread, listening to the wind howl and the house creak and the occasional snap of a trap in the night. She caught fewer mice now, maybe 1 or 2 a week, a sign that her defenses were holding and the population was learning to avoid her cabin. But she did not let her guard down. She continued the inspections, the cleaning, the inventory checks, and she started doing something new. She began counting meals, not in terms of days or weeks, but in terms of individual meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, each one planned and portioned from her supplies. She calculated how much rice per serving, how much flour for a batch of bread, how much dried beans needed to provide adequate protein. She wrote it all down in her logbook, a running tally of meals remaining based on current inventory and consumption rate. By her count, if she maintained strict rationing and had no losses to contamination or spoilage, she had enough food to last until April with a small reserve for emergencies. But that calculation assumed 0 waste. Every contaminated cup of flour was 3 meals lost. Every bag of oats destroyed by mice was 4 meals gone. The margin was tight enough that even small losses added up to survival risk. The neighbor came back in mid-December. This time he was not asking for food. He was asking for help. The mice were out of control, he said. They had gotten into everything. Bags torn open, boxes chewed through, droppings everywhere. His son had gotten sick, probably from eating contaminated food before they realized how bad it was. Stomach cramps, fever, weakness. They could not risk leaving him to drive to town for medical help, not in this weather, so they were treating him with what they had and hoping it passed. But they needed to stop the mice before they lost the rest of their supplies. The widow grabbed her bag of tools and traps and followed him through the snow. The scene in his cabin was worse than she expected. The pantry was a disaster, open bags spilling grain onto shelves, gnawed boxes leaking pasta, droppings mixed into everything. The smell was sharp and acrid, the distinctive scent of rodent urine. She asked when they had last cleaned. He said a few days ago, maybe a week, hard to keep up with it. She told him that was the problem. Mice followed scent trails. Every crumb, every spill, every dropped grain was a marker telling them where to come back. If you did not clean immediately after every meal, you were laying out a map for them. She spent the next 4 hours helping them clean. Every shelf scrubbed with vinegar water. Every loose grain swept up and disposed of. All contaminated food thrown out. No exceptions. Because you could not see bacteria and you could not risk illness when you were isolated and weak. She showed them how to seal the remaining supplies in containers, using metal cans and glass jars where possible. Plastic bins with tight lids as a backup. She set out a dozen traps, placed strategically near evidence of travel routes, and showed them how to check and reset daily. She walked the perimeter of the cabin with a candle, looking for drafts that would indicate entry points, and found 7 places where mice were getting in. She packed them with steel wool, sealed them with caulk, marked them with chalk so they could monitor whether the seals held. And she told them the hard truth. They had probably lost 25 pounds of food to contamination, which represented roughly 35 meals for 2 people. assuming standard portions. If they continued at their current consumption rate with no further losses, they would run short by late February. They needed to ration starting now, reduce portions, stretch everything, and they needed to maintain constant vigilance against further raids. The neighbor looked shaken. He thanked her, said he should have listened earlier. She said there was no point dwelling on it now, just move forward and do better. The pattern repeated itself through December and into January with other neighbors. A couple living a half-mile south lost 8 pounds of flour and 6 pounds of sugar in a single night, when a family of mice found a gap behind their stove and chewed through paper bags stored in a bottom cupboard. A woman living alone reported finding mouse nests in her bedding, built from insulation and food packaging, contaminated with urine to the point that she had to burn the blankets and sleep in her coat until she could improvise replacements. An older man discovered too late that mice had gotten into his seed potatoes stored in the root cellar, gnawed through dozens of them, left them rotting and unusable for spring planting. Each time the widow helped. She brought traps, showed them how to seal food properly, taught them the inspection routines, explained the mathematics of loss. And each time they looked at her with new eyes, understanding finally why she had seemed so obsessive, why she had warned them, why she had spent so much effort on prevention. But the understanding came too late for most of them. The food was already lost. The calories were already gone, and winter was not half over. By late January, the widow had caught and disposed of 37 mice in and around her cabin. But her food stores remained intact. Every tin opened cleanly, no contamination, no losses. She maintained her meal counts, updating the logbook after every meal, and the numbers held steady. She had preserved what others had lost. While her neighbors were cutting portions and going to bed hungry and burning through their reserves faster than planned, she was maintaining adequate nutrition, keeping her strength, staying healthy. It was not luck. It was not chance. It was the result of systematic preparation and constant vigilance, and a willingness to do the unglamorous work of prevention every single day. And when the brutal cold snap hit in early February, when the temperature dropped to 35 below and stayed there for a week, when the wind came down from the mountains like a living thing and the walls of every cabin groaned under the pressure, when people were burning through firewood twice as fast and eating extra calories just to maintain body heat, the widow's system proved its worth in the most concrete way possible. The neighbor came to her door on the 5th day of the cold snap. He looked gaunt, his face hollow, his hands shaking even inside thick gloves. He said they were rationing down to 2 meals a day, and even that might not be enough. They had lost more food than he realized, contamination they had missed during the cleaning, and now they were looking at running out completely by mid-March. He asked if she had anything to spare, anything at all, said he would pay her back in spring, work for her, cut firewood, whatever she needed. She invited him inside, sat him down by the fire, made him tea, and then she opened her logbook and showed him the numbers. She had started the winter with supplies calculated for 150 meals, based on standard portions. In the 3 months since the first snow, she had consumed 71 meals, right on schedule. But according to her records, she should have lost at minimum 14 meals to the mouse raids that everyone was experiencing. 4 breaches per week was the average in this area during severe winters, and each breach typically resulted in contamination of enough food to represent 1 to 2 meals. By that calculation, any normal storage system would have lost at least 14 meals by now, probably more. But her system, the tins and seals and constant vigilance, had resulted in 0 losses. Not a single meal contaminated, not a single calorie wasted. Those 14 meals, still intact in her stores, were the difference between her stability and the desperation everyone else was facing. She gave him 10 pounds of beans and 5 pounds of cornmeal, measured out carefully, a loan that she could afford because she had preserved what she was supposed to have lost. He took the food with trembling hands, thanked her, said he understood now why she did things the way she did. She told him it was not about being right or proving a point. It was about recognizing that in an environment this harsh, there was no room for waste. Every calorie mattered, every meal counted, and the small daily disciplines, the boring, repetitive tasks that seemed excessive when everything was fine, Those were exactly what kept you alive when conditions turned extreme. He nodded, held the bag of beans like it was gold, and trudged back out into the cold. The widow continued her routines. The cold snap broke after a week, temperatures rising to a more manageable 10 below, and people emerged from their cabins to take stock. The community grapevine, such as it was, began reporting losses. One household running short, projecting they would need resupply by March. Another dealing with illness from contaminated food, treating it with herbs and hope. A third considering whether to risk the drive out to town despite impassable roads, because staying might be worse. The widow listened to these reports with quiet sympathy but no surprise. This was what happened when you ignored the small threats until they became large problems. Mice were not dramatic. They were not the kind of danger you could see coming and prepare for in an adrenaline rush. They were incremental, persistent, easily dismissed, right up until the moment their cumulative damage became impossible to ignore. She thought about this as she went through her evening routine. Check the traps, clean, empty if necessary, reset. Inspect the cabin, look for new gaps, seal anything suspicious. Prepare dinner, eat slowly, savor each bite because she could afford to. Clean up immediately, no crumbs, no spills. Update the logbook, count the meals remaining. By her current calculation, she had 79 meals left in her stores, which would take her through April with a comfortable margin. Those 14 meals she had preserved, the ones that would have been lost to contamination in a normal scenario, had given her a buffer that translated directly to security. She could help her neighbors, share supplies when asked, because she had kept what others had lost. And she could do it without risk to her own survival, which was not selfishness, but prudent resource management. You could not help anyone if you were starving yourself. The winter dragged on. February turned to March. The light changed. The days grew incrementally longer, though the cold did not relent. The widow maintained her systems, caught the occasional mouse, kept her stores sealed and clean. Her neighbors struggled in varying degrees, some worse than others, all of them wishing they had listened when she first explained the risks. But wishes did not change past decisions. The only thing you could do was learn and apply those lessons going forward. And by the time the first thaw came in late March, melting the top layer of snow and turning the world into a mess of mud and slush, everyone in the valley understood what the widow had tried to tell them months earlier. Prevention was not paranoia, preparation was not excessive, and the boring daily work of maintaining systems was what kept you alive when the margins were thin and the stakes were survival. She stood outside her cabin one afternoon in early April, watching the runoff create small streams through the melting drifts, listening to the drip of water from the eaves. The worst was over. They had made it through. Not easily, not comfortably, but they had survived. And when she went back inside and looked at her shelves, at the rows of metal tins, still half full, at the logbook showing meals preserved and losses prevented, she felt something close to satisfaction. Not pride exactly, because pride assumed you had done something exceptional. What she had done was simply recognize reality and respond appropriately. She had seen a threat, understood its nature, and taken systematic steps to mitigate it. The fact that this seemed exceptional to others said more about their assumptions than about her efforts. The lessons from that winter spread through the community in the months that followed. When people restocked their supplies for the next season, many of them bought metal containers. They asked the widow questions about storage, about sealing techniques, about how to inspect for entry points and what kind of traps worked best. She answered patiently, showed them what she had learned, emphasized that there was no single magic solution. It was a system, a collection of small habits that reinforced each other. Clean constantly, store properly, inspect regularly, seal entry points before mice found them. Keep detailed records so you knew exactly what you had and what you could afford to lose. And never assume that the problem would solve itself or that you were immune to the same forces affecting everyone else. The cold did not care about your assumptions. The mice did not care about your confidence. Nature followed its own logic, and your job was to understand that logic well enough to work within it rather than against it. She thought about this often as spring progressed and the valley turned green and people planted gardens and restocked woodpiles and prepared for the next cycle. They were better prepared now, more realistic, less likely to dismiss warnings about unglamorous threats. But she knew memory was short, and that in the comfort of summer, when food was abundant and the cold was a distant abstraction, it would be easy to slip back into complacency, easy to think the precautions were excessive, easy to cut corners and tell yourself it would probably be fine, and maybe it would be, for a while. Maybe you could get away with inadequate preparation for a season or two. But eventually, the conditions would turn harsh again, the margins would get thin again, and the small decisions you made during easy times would determine whether you survived or struggled during hard times. The widow understood this in her bones. She had learned it through experience, through loss, through the slow accumulation of knowledge that came from paying attention to details others ignored. And she continued her routines even in summer, maintaining the systems that had kept her alive, because discipline was not something you switched on and off based on immediate conditions. It was a practice you maintained constantly, so that when the need arose, the behaviors were already automatic. By the time the next winter approached, she was ready. Her stores rebuilt, her containers checked and sealed, her cabin inspected and fortified. And when the first snow came and the temperatures dropped and the mice began their inevitable search for food and warmth, she was waiting with traps set and defenses layered, and the calm certainty that she had done everything possible to protect what she needed to survive. This is the reality of living in harsh environments, the thing that anyone who spends time in remote places during difficult seasons eventually learns. The big dramatic emergencies, the ones that make good stories, are actually rare. What gets you is the accumulation of small problems that you ignored or underestimated. A mouse raid here, a contaminated bag there, a gap in the wall you thought was too small to matter. Each one seems minor in isolation, but they add up. And by the time you realize the cumulative damage, you are already in crisis. The widow's success was not about being smarter or tougher than anyone else. It was about taking the small threats seriously, treating prevention as a daily practice rather than a one-time event, and understanding that survival was not about dramatic heroism, but about consistent, unglamorous competence. Those 14 meals she preserved, the ones that represented the difference between adequate nutrition and dangerous shortage, were the direct result of choices made every single day. Cleaning when she was tired, inspecting when it seemed unnecessary, sealing gaps that seemed too small to matter, using metal containers even though they were heavier and more expensive and required more work. Each individual action was minor. Together they created a system robust enough to withstand pressures that broke others. If you take one lesson from this, let it be this: respect the incremental threats. The small pests that seem like nuisances rather than dangers. The maintenance tasks that seem tedious rather than critical. The preparation steps that seem excessive rather than prudent. Because in an environment where margins are thin and resupply is uncertain and consequences accumulate slowly, those are exactly the things that determine outcomes. You do not need to be paranoid, but you do need to be realistic about the actual conditions you face and the actual vulnerabilities in your systems. And you need to be willing to do the boring daily work of maintaining defenses even when there is no immediate evidence of threat. Because by the time the evidence is obvious, you have already lost ground. The widow still lives in that valley, still maintains her systems, still helps neighbors who ask. Her shelves are still lined with metal tins, her floors still swept twice a day, her logbook still updated after every meal. People do not laugh anymore when they see the precautions. They ask questions instead. They take notes. They implement their own versions of her methods, adapted to their specific circumstances but built on the same principles. And every winter, when the cold settles in and the snow piles deep and the mice begin their raids, those systems prove their worth, not through dramatic rescues or last-minute saves, but through the quiet accumulation of meals preserved, contamination prevented, calories protected. The kind of success you measure in what did not go wrong, in disasters that never happened, in steady stability maintained despite external pressures. It is not glamorous, but it works. And if you found value in understanding how small systematic actions can mean the difference between thriving and struggling, between security and crisis, then consider subscribing. These stories, these practical lessons drawn from real situations, They matter because they show what actually works when conditions are harsh and margin for error is thin. Not fantasy solutions or dramatic interventions, but the boring, competent daily work that keeps systems functional and people safe. Subscribe to see more stories like this. More practical knowledge drawn from people who learned through experience what actually matters when survival depends on getting details right. Because the next time you face a situation where small threats accumulate and margins are tight, you want to be the person who took prevention seriously, who maintained systems consistently, who preserved what others lost. You want to be the one who learned before consequences forced the lesson.